This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us on this Thursday's program, we start with K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. He's joining us to share the highlights of a beef trade report that he and Derrell of Oklahoma State University put together that illustrates the key role that the United States beef import and export markets play in supporting our current beef industry. Also ahead, Rural Forestry Program Coordinator with the Kansas Forestry Service, Ryan Armbrust, provides information on the upcoming 26th Annual Fall Forestry Field Day. We end today's programming with K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone. He explains how mulch promotes root development in the fall and offers protection in the winter from the typical Kansas freeze and thaw cycles. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Glynn Tonsor. He is a K-State livestock economist. Glynn, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Samantha.
Absolutely. I was about to introduce the topic and got ahead of myself, but today we're going to be talking about this beef trade report that you and Derrell have put together.
Yeah, so you can find this report in an executive summary because it is a lengthy report. Most of our listeners will probably like the 5-page summary more on agmanager.info, as most of our references and resources are there. The title of the project is called Assessing Economic Impact. That would follow loss of U.S. beef exports and imports. Yes, it's a long title, but it also tells you, basically, the punchline is Derrell and I were tasked with describing why we trade beef. All this is international. It's not interstate. It's with other countries, both importing of beef as well as exporting of beef. So a fair amount of our lengthy report is just documenting patterns in imports and exports. And then the kind of the back end of it was quantifying what would happen if we did not. So if for any reason we ceased to trade, regardless of why that is, if we quit importing and exporting beef, what would be the economic impact of that? So that gives a quick summary of the title, where you can find it, kind of what we did. Now we can break that down a little bit.
Absolutely. And before we do that, getting into what inspired this, it's a lengthy report. Like you said, a lot of time and effort went into it. So what really inspired the partnership with Derrell and then the creation of this report?
Yeah, so Derrell, as our listeners know, because he's regularly on here also, is my partner down at Oklahoma State. And if you generalize this beyond Derrell and I for a moment, livestock economists that are working in the meat and livestock space for many years, and I would assess decades, have fielded questions from producers, in this case cattle producers, beef, the beef industry. The same thing happens in other species as well, but we're focused on beef today. Where does our product go? Why do we import and export? What is the role of that in our economic system? Those are very common questions when you engage with producers. So there's long-standing interest in just understanding this. And it makes sense. People like me talk about consumer demand drives a lot of what we're doing. That feeds back into why we produce what we do. But the notion of consumer demand is very broad. It's both foreign consumers as well as domestic. And then when you look even more narrowly, is we don't just have cow-calf, stocker, feedlot, packer, processor in a generic sense, and then end user. There's a lot of additional processing and transformation and narrowly blending of products that are sort of in the middle of our industry that has a lot to do with why we import, specifically ground beef production we'll talk about in a moment. But there's a lot of interest in understanding that is my best answer for you. And that's been there for a long time. Parts of the pandemic elevated that interest, people taking note of just the meat situation in general and so forth. So long-standing interest, and then just people asking general questions, because we live in a world where you can ask questions. Social media and the like, you can go find information, good or bad, on about any topic, right? So there's just a lot of ongoing interest in the topic of beef trade.
Absolutely. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get into this report, starting with, you mentioned kind of the impacts of taking away imports versus exports. What did that really show when you broke it down?
Yeah, so without losing folks in the the jargon, I'm going to reference our executive summary multiple times because Derrell and I try to write it jargon-free. Is the punchline would be if we did lose beef trade internationally at the live animal stage, so think feedlot for slaughter cattle and then feeder cattle, cow-calf background stocker segment, the quantities that we have in our industry would shrink, and the prices of those cattle would shrink as well. That's a result of a net decline in demand for those cattle because of the combined demand and supply shocks that correspond with ceasing imports and exports of beef. So before I lose us anymore, the live animal part of the cattle industry would be worse off because there'd be a smaller industry. Fewer in quantity means fewer animals at a lower price, so you economically shrink the industry is the punchline. Look to the other end of the chain, because sitting here at a land-grant university, we got to think about consumers as well, not just the producer side of this, is also consumers would be worse off. So again, over this, we map out 10-year effects in a geeky model called an equilibrium displacement model for those that want to read the full report, is consumers would see less beef available at a higher price. So again, consumers lose. This is domestic consumers when I say that from this. So domestic consumers are worse off. Domestic cattle producers are worse off because we shrink the beef cattle industry. That would be the punchline, kind of the back end of this report. The front end documents the trade patterns over time.
And then when it comes to some of the, particulars of this report, some of the highlights, what really should those tuning in know that you guys found?
Yeah, so up front, we try to put, again, we do our best to be jargon-free, get economic logic on paper of why we trade. And at the end of the day, they are just market forces at lots of different levels. So lots of different individual companies and entities import beef for different reasons, and then sometimes, usually different entities, export beef for different reasons. We belabor the point that not all beef is equal. The simplest example here would be as a ribeye steak isn't the same as ground beef. Our listeners know that, but there's a lot more nuance to that story than that. Is how do we get ground beef in the U.S. is a function of a very calculated and very complex blending exercise. The most common exercise is we blend highly lean, so think 90% or more lean products, with less lean products that might come from our steer and heifer slaughter processes. And I give you that example because for many decades now, that's a core of why we import beef, is we import a highly lean input into the ground beef production chain that supplements, and please note I use the term supplements, our heifer and steer-based processing trim, which is less lean. So if you want to hit an 80% lean target on a ground beef package, you can do that by blending something that's 90 and something that's 50 in the right proportions, to give a simple example. So the industry's done that for a long time. The industry also imports sometimes for targeted consumer reasons. So if you got a Brazilian steakhouse, you might import for that. If you have a restaurant that's in a certain part of our country with a higher Hispanic population, you may import specifically for that. So that's a flavor of some of the things on the import side. We talk a lot more about that in depth in the report. It also gives you some insight about where we import from. So Canada and Mexico are North American trading partners that are always, top 5. We also import from the Southern Hemisphere, Australia, New Zealand, now some Brazil. That's documented. Actually, a 50-year pattern of that is documented in the report. That has changed over time. The relative role of Australia is lower today than it was 10 years ago. But for anybody that likes those details, they can pull that up. I'll transition over to exports, because remember, we're talking about both sides, both import and export. We export things that have higher value outside the U.S. than in it, is the first summary statement. Outside of this report, I usually use the example with producers of tongue. Yours truly, the Tonsor household, doesn't eat a lot of beef tongue. Does not mean we're too good for it, but we just don't place the same value on it that some other customers, it might be in Mexico or an Asian market, would place on that, and market forces lead those products to be exported. Generalize that a little bit. There's things like liver and short ribs that we export a fairly high percentage of what we produce. At the end of the day, that leads to higher value. That's sort of why we export. So I hope you heard me on, we try to give a jargon-free summary, and I just give you kind of a Cliff Note summary of it, of why the industry's evolved over time to both import and export beef. So
it helps support some of those markets that we don't have strong support for here in the U.S., like you mentioned, those uniquer cuts of things potentially. But it also just means, like you said, that import-wise, we're getting what our consumers are wanting. So without these imports, how would our market really change?
Well, and it would shrink is the summary, right? So the quantities being produced would shrink, and consumers would face higher prices, but cattle producers lower prices because of less demand for their cattle in that story. I highlight the ground component, and that is a big component historically of this trade, why we import. It's also important to remember just how far east and west our country goes. So it is a long ways from Seattle to Boston. And why am I giving you that example? Is one of the reasons that the Canadian industry, is a regular trading partner both on imports and exports, is at times we do a lot of north-south trade that avoids both countries going east and west. So, for example, you may have a product that is coming out of Alberta that goes into our northwest states, because logistically and just transport costs are a lot lower than maybe getting a very similar product from, say, Iowa or Nebraska, just simple mileage difference. Similarly, you may have a product going into our northeastern states that comes from somewhere in eastern Canada and vice versa. Some of this is as simple as quote-unquote boring logistics, is if you have fewer road miles or there's something, it reduces the cost of the product. I highlight that because that doesn't get talked about a lot, but there's good reasons that some partners, particularly in this case Canada and Mexico, are both major import and export customers and partners in the story. And at the end of the day, they're part of a broader, very integrated North American beef cattle industry.
And if producers are tuning in and they're wanting to look at this report in its entirety, or maybe the Cliff Notes as you keep referring to them as, where can they find that information at?
Yeah, so our agmanager.info website, which most of our listeners are familiar with here at K-State, we have a trade section, narrowly under livestock and meat is where it's housed. You can also go to the contributors tab, and this is a good reminder in general for our listeners, is everything that's posted that's tied back to one of about a dozen of us. I'm one of the dozen I'm referring to here that are faculty or staff in K-State Ag Econ Department. Under the contributors tab, you can find my name. I usually joke bald economist, but actually just pull up Tonsor and you'll find it. And there's reverse chronological order of all our postings, and you'll find this report, which was posted here in September, so you can find it there, as well as other related information, of course.
Excellent. Well, as always, it will also be included in the show notes of today's program, which can be found on agtoday.net, so an easy-to-click link there. But, Glynn, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me on, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Glynn Tonsor. He is a K-State livestock economist, sharing the latest beef trade report that him and Derrell from Oklahoma State University have put together, summarizing import and export impacts here in the U.S. Before we cut to a short break here, still ahead, we have Rural Forestry Program Coordinator with the Kansas Forestry Service, Ryan Armbrust. He's providing information on the upcoming 26th Annual Fall Forestry Field Day, and he shares that the program will highlight pecan production, the lumber industry, and wildfire information. Also still ahead, K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, is explaining how mulch promotes root development in the fall and offers protection in the winter from the typical Kansas freeze and thaw cycles. Like I mentioned, all of that is still to come here ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Ryan Armbrust. He is the Rural Forestry Program Coordinator. So, Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Absolutely. And you're with the Kansas Forestry Service. I should clarify that. But you guys do partner with K-State quite often.
Yeah, we do. So we're a state agency that's sort of administratively located within K-State University, which is really a great relationship to be able to be a state service agency within a great research institute and land-grant university like K-State.
Absolutely. Lends to endless opportunities for collaboration. And one of those opportunities for collaboration is this upcoming 26th Annual Fall Forestry Field Day that you guys are hosting. You're collaborating with a bunch of different organizations, but K-State's one of them.
They are, yeah. So our Fall Forestry Field Day that we love to put on to really feature private landowners and the awesome work they've been doing out there. We've got a number of different speakers that are going to come and talk this year, including a retired K-State researcher, Dr. Bill Reed, who, if you want to know anything about pecans, he's just absolutely wonderful speaker, very knowledgeable. But we've got some folks from Wildlife and Parks. We've got some folks from our wildfire management side of our agency. We've even got some folks who are going to put on a sawmill demonstration to show what it's like when you open up a tree and see what the timber inside looks like. So really wide-ranging. We're really excited about all the different stuff we're going to be able to talk about and show the public. Absolutely.
And then in terms of when this event is and where can listeners expect to see this?
Yeah, so this is October 26th. That's a Wednesday at the end of October down in Neosho County, just outside of Erie, Kansas. And if you've ever driven on Highway 59 past Erie and seen the big yellow barn and wanted to know what it looks like inside, this is where the field day is. The landowner is going to be doing some tours of that historic timber-framed barn, and it's worth coming just for that, I think.
Absolutely. And I understand it's the Camburn family that is hosting this or allowing you guys to host this event on their property. So tell us a little bit about the Camburn family and their background.
Yeah, so the Camburn family, like so many, of our landowners in Kansas, really demonstrate, this sense of stewardship. They do the right things for the right reasons, and they try and seek out, the best advice they can get from natural resource professionals. They've been managing this land for a couple generations, and they've managed to get all kinds of different products and benefits out of this. They get pecans off this property. They have cut timber out of this property. In fact, the numbers I've got is since 1987, they've got over 300,000 board feet of timber out of this. But they also, at the same time, support all kinds of wildlife benefits for game wildlife and non-game wildlife. It's just a really great way of seeing multiple uses and multiple benefits out of a property managed, again, for the right reasons by just a great stewardship family, the Camburns.
This family has had, you've mentioned the accolades that they've received, just, speaking on their behalf of how well they do stewardship-wise, but they've actually received awards based on this recently as well.
They have. In 2018, they were recognized as the Forest Stewardship Tree Farmer of the Year in Kansas, and that award really recognizes that for the last 32 years they've been certified. River Farms, which is the name of their farm, has been certified in the American Tree Farm System for practicing sustainable forestry, managing for, as they say, wood, water, wildlife, and recreation. So really doing it the right way, and have been doing it the right way for over 32 years.
Absolutely. So a chance to not only hear from experts within the industry and all these, significant talks that are going to be going on, but also to get to learn from a family that has been within it and doing well within the industry for the past, like you said, several decades. Absolutely.
They've had success in managing the right way, and I think they look forward to sharing that success with, other landowners just like them to show that this can be done, and it can really be a successful outcome for your family and for the land.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned pecan trees, and we were joking beforehand. I didn't know there was such a large pecan industry in Kansas.
There is. So many people hear pecan and they think Texas, and nothing against Texas. They've got a whole lot of pecans down there. But southeast Kansas has a ton of pecan orchards and groves and native pecan stands. All along the Neosho River, you can find pecans growing in the lowlands, and you can find families like the Camburns who've planted pecan plantations. The Camburns have got 11 acres of pecans that they've planted and harvest nuts off each year. And in fact, Kathy goes out and grafts them every year. If you want to know anything about grafting and how to do it right and how to learn from your mistakes, Kathy will be there to tell us about that in October. But there's a ton of pecan industry down there, and I love in the fall, usually sometime in November, I'll get down there and I'll drive past a roadside stand selling freshly harvested pecans and stop and get a couple of paper bags of them and bring them home and clean them and make some sort of pecan pie or just eat them fresh because they're so good.
That season is quickly approaching where pecan pies are becoming more and more frequently consumed. So a good time as ever to, learn about pecans and maybe grab some while you're down there. But you mentioned also Bill Reed. He's a former K-State researcher that was heavily involved in research involving pecans. So what can we expect to hear from Bill at this event?
You can expect, as always, a memorable talk from Bill Reed. There is no one more passionate and more knowledgeable about pecans, and there's no one who's going to give it to you as straight when it comes to what's going to work and what isn't than Bill Reed. We almost always have just a great talk from him, and he'll tell you more about the cultivars that you can grow for nut production, the spacing, how you need to thin things, and then he'll grab his pruners and cut a couple open and show you what the developing nut meats look like and give you a lesson on pecan physiology. Just a great asset that we've got in the area, and we're very fortunate that even in his retirement, he's been willing to share his knowledge and passion for pecans.
Absolutely. A wonderful resource for sure. And then outside of pecans, you're going to cover a bunch of other topics, and you mentioned some of those briefly. But for those that may be listening and they're thinking, well, I'm almost sold on this event, what else can they expect to hear?
So we're going to also cover sort of timber production, both in how to sort of thin and manage your forest stand so you can maximize or at least facilitate a lot of timber production should you want to manage that way for a long-term crop, but also getting wildlife benefit and wildlife habitat out of that at the same time. So we're going to both see how to do that, hear from wildlife biologists on what kind of habitat we're looking to create. We're also going to have a sawmill out there so you can see what some of these trees look like on the inside. We're also going to talk a little bit about how to establish things in terms of tree planting and tree shelters. But it's not just forestry for the trees, right? We're also going to talk about how to manage your forest land to reduce wildfire risk. We're also going to be talking about how to use that prescribed fire to increase the value and ecosystem functionality in timber and grasslands. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about some forest health and forest pest issues with emerald ash borer, which is known to be all throughout northeast Kansas, not yet in southeast Kansas, but we'll have our forest health specialist come out and do a demonstration on how we can look and see if we've got emerald ash borer on our property.
Excellent. Yeah. Great information to get ahead of things like that as it expands slowly across the state for sure. Mm-hmm. And then I know that you guys are hosting this huge event. You're expecting a big turnout because it's been 2 years since the last one was held. It
has. Our 2020 event we had to cancel, unfortunately, just due to the global epidemic with COVID, of course. And then last year we were all set to host it, but then we had just torrential rains in the area that really precluded us from being able to do an effective field day without everyone having to wear, muck boots and get in boats. But we're excited to be able to get back into the field this year and show off, again, just a wonderful landowner property. We're expecting big turnouts, and we hope people pre-register soon. And sort of as a catch to that, this will be catered by Marsh's Deli out of Fort Scott, which is known throughout the region for having just wonderful sandwiches. So we hope people turn out for, if nothing else, the sandwiches and the historic barn tour, and maybe they can see some neat forestry stuff while they're there.
Absolutely. And in terms of registration, if those that are tuning in are listening and they're hoping to attend, where can they register at?
Yeah, so if you go to our website, which is kansasforests.org, you can find a link on there to register. You can also give us a call at our state office. Our phone number is 785-532-3300, or just Google Kansas Forest Service and look for the event. We're going to feature it pretty prominently on our social media and on our website.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan, I will also have those resources linked in the show notes of today's program, which can be found on agtoday.net. So just an easy way for listeners to tune in and see all of our resources listed in one spot if they're interested in learning more about any of them mentioned in today's show. But we thank you so much for your time today, Ryan.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to see you down there in Neosho County at the end of October.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm hoping to attend myself. I'm looking forward to learning more about this event. Once again, that was Ryan Armbrust. He is the Rural Forestry Program Coordinator with the Kansas Forest Service. As always, if you are on the go and listening to us on the radio with one of our radio station partners, and you're wanting to listen to more from Agriculture Today through the rest of today's programming, be sure to check out our podcast. We are available as a podcast anywhere podcasts can be found. Simply search for Agriculture Today, and you should find us there. So that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, once again, anywhere podcasts can be found. Be sure to give us a listen, and that's also where the show notes for today's program can also be found with all of the available links that are discussed during today's program. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Fall is the perfect time to add mulch where needed around trees, shrubs, and some perennials. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, says that mulch helps decrease the fluctuation of soil temperatures, promoting root development this fall and protecting the soil from the freeze-thaw cycles of a typical Kansas winter. Greg, with fall officially here, probably a good time to start thinking about mulching trees and getting ready for that colder weather.
That's right. It's always a good idea to have some mulch around our trees, shrubs, and some perennials, particularly hybrid tea roses or ones that aren't necessarily as cold hardy as some of our other plant material. It's good to give them a little bit of insulation, and so wood chip mulch or something like that would be ideal.
I'm assuming that we're going to be putting down some water prior to all of this as well?
One of the good aspects of mulch is it holds in some moisture. It reduces the evaporation out of the soil. And so If you got bare soil, that's good for some things, but as far as holding moisture, that's not. And so if it hasn't provided some natural rainfall, it would be okay to go ahead and put down some moisture, although most of our good mulch types will allow that moisture through. And so if we get some snow or some rain, that's going to provide that moisture for our plant roots.
I know when we're trying to do it as kind of a weed barrier, we go maybe 3-4 inches. Is that still what we want to do for this?
It could be. We may not have a lot of weed competition here in this type of season and through the winter. Now, we do have some winter annuals that may be still coming in. And so if you're trying to suppress some weeds, a little thicker mulch is preferred. But if we're looking more at just some insulation, and when I say insulation, we're not necessarily saying preventing cold, but reducing the fluctuation of those soil temperatures during the winter time, especially our rooted plants that don't have a deep root system. The freeze-thaw cycle of a typical winter time can maybe elevate those roots to where they'll desiccate and dry out. And so this mulch layer helps prevent that, along with keeping the soil warm here in the fall so we get some good root development before we get into real freezing temperatures. One caution, I guess, there is you could maybe overdo it, depending on our soil texture that we're working with, our garden is. If it's a real heavy clay type of soil, putting another layer of oxygen-reducing material over that may not be the best for our plant health. So if you have a really heavy clay, you may want to be a little shallower. As far as the materials you're using, you want something that's coarse. So what we want is that airflow through from the soil to allow oxygen into those roots because they will be respiring and require oxygen. And so if you have a heavy clay soil, something that's looser, if you have more of a sandy soil, you can put it on thicker and maybe have something that's a little more dense type of material that you're using.
Is there kind of a due-by date for something like this? When should we start this process?
Yeah, I think any time is a good time to mulch. And so, if you're looking at weed control, it may be sooner than later. If you're looking at maybe some more insulation, we got a little bit of time yet. But it's really kind of almost a year-round type of practice that you can use. It's going to be good. The only time you may not want to do it is in early spring when you want those soil temperatures actually to warm up. And so an added layer is going to keep that soil cooler, but that's just if you're trying to expedite some plant growth in the springtime.
You mentioned wood chips earlier. Is there anything else that we can use?
There are lots of options out there, and I guess I would say if you had a rule of thumb that you could probably get away with without thinking too much is using what we call Armbrust wood chips. These materials are very coarse, and that provides that aeration through the soil. So if you're putting that on, you could put 4, 6, 8 inches maybe even over the soil, not create a problem. If you're using something more of the hardwood bark mulch, those things, probably don't need to add quite as much of that. That comes into more preference of the look that you're wanting for your mulch. If you're looking at just plant health, I think the wood chips from the Armbrust is ideal. But, just applying something is going to be very beneficial, I think, for your trees, shrubs, definitely some perennials. And again, we talked about some of our plants that aren't quite as cold hardy, providing an extra layer just to prevent that fluctuation of hot and cold that can really disturb plant health.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, with information on applying mulch this fall. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.